All right, good morning. Last one, except for the conclusion next week, right? And again, come next week because, and I'll mention this at the end again too. We'll go through just a quick conclusion, kind of summary of the book, but then also there are plans. Dax and Brandon have plans to continue an adult Sunday school in the morning, but they do want some input, so we'll talk about what are some things that we want and what kinds of things should we look for to teach. Right? Do we want to have different teachers taking turns? Do we want to just go through a book of the Bible? So just think about all that, and I'll go through that at the end too. So.
I thought you were going to say when we have a test.
Yeah. we did last week. You missed it.
We all aced it.
Anybody want to open a prayer?
Sure.
Okay, thank you.
Father, thank you for this morning and just this season as we're going into Christmas. Thank you for sending your Son down to the earth to live his perfect life and die for us. And God, just thank you that your word is more accessible and more understandable now than it has ever been. And we get to sit here and read a book about it and just find out how unbelievably true it is in ways that people even 100 years ago never could have. So God, just thank you for that, and thank you for this time we have together. In Jesus' name.
Thank you. Okay, so some people call this a Christological argument, but Orland focuses on the C.S. Lewis thing. Oh, come on. Oh, because I have to plug this in. Sorry. Why it just magically doesn't work the computer on its own. Okay. All right. Right now. There we go. So he focuses on C.S. Lewis's, liar, lord, lunatic. He started talking about is it a legend? And so that's what we were dealing with last week, right? We were trying to show that it'd be impossible to be a legend because the New Testament was written early. It'd be impossible to be a legend because the doctrines of resurrection and Jesus is God were taught immediately after the cross. It didn't follow the pattern where legends take many, many, many years to develop. And then we looked at what we have now in the Bible is what they wrote. Okay? So we can be confident we're reading what the original authors wrote. So that's from last week. Anything left from last week? Okay, so this week continues that. So we've got early evidence that things are written down early, all within the lifetime of the eyewitnesses. So someone could have said, "Hey, that's wrong." So now we're going to focus on three things this week. What Orland focused on, that Jesus did actually claim to be God, and it's a common thing that is said. Well, Jesus never claimed to be God. That's something that happened at the Council of Nicaea. But we'll show you that. Did actually claim to be God, and that's kind of what I did with that chain of evidence too that I ended with last week. That was all being taught prior to the first council. If you follow the writings of the students of the apostles, okay. There is historical evidence for the resurrection. I got the pleasure of sitting for several lectures with Gary Habermas, talking about the historical evidence of the resurrection. He's got some volumes coming out on all the evidence. It's rather impressive. So we'll talk about that. And then Orland talks about the principle of embarrassment and why that's good evidence that the gospel writers weren't lying, that they weren't making it up. So any thoughts before we start? Thoughts on what you read? Yeah.
I just found it interesting at the very end of the book. He talked about how the last part of the book is different, and he talked about history, and history cannot be proved
Right.
the way science can be proved. I thought that was for me, that was a very interesting point.
Right.
And you never read a historian never says this proves,
Right.
says this suggests, or this this persuades one to think, but you never hear a historian say this proves.
Right.
But you hear that from scientists. with
And a lot of times they say it when it actually doesn't.
Right,
Yeah, right.
True that.
Yeah, and not all, in fact, very little science is deduction.
True.
Most science is other forms.
Yes.
That really you can't prove it.
Right.
Yeah, any other thoughts? Thank you.
I love the conclusion of this section being not, okay, Jesus is God, blah, 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 become a Christian, but basically, because this is so possible and reasonable to actually believe,
Right.
you have to do your research. You can't just walk away.
Right. Right.
And it's like, yeah, because if you do your research, you'll get there.
And I think one of his points is, I hope I've given you enough so that you at least have to think about it.
Yeah,
This kind of
exactly.
was his whole
Yeah.
point. Okay, so I'll start with the video. This is another William Lane Craig video on did Jesus claim to be God? Believe it or not, it's a common thing that non-Christians will say. Well, Jesus didn't even claim to be God in there, but I think you'll see after today that he did. So I'm going to turn this off in between because of that buzz. I don't know what the volume is like here. So.
Christian movement began, followers of Jesus Christ have said he was God in...
Back it up. There we go.
And now it's not going again.
Christ have said he would...
There.
Ever since the Christian movement began, followers of Jesus Christ have said he was God in human form. But what about Jesus himself? Who did he think he was? With the rise of textual criticism and the modern study of history, historians have developed tools to unlock this question. Today, Jesus of Nazareth is no longer just a figure in a stained glass window, but a real person of history whose life can be investigated historically. So let's examine the New Testament, not as inspired scripture, but as an ordinary collection of ancient documents. Let's apply to them the standard tests we would use with regard to any other ancient sources. When historians investigate the Jesus of history, what do they find? First, Jesus claimed to be the Messiah. The Jews of Jesus' day were waiting for a promised Messiah, a descendant of King David, a warrior king who would bring military victory and spiritual renewal to Israel. They were familiar with the prophet Zechariah's ancient words. Shout aloud, O daughter of Jerusalem, behold, your king is coming to you. Righteous and having salvation is he, humble and mounted on a donkey. Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem on the back of a donkey, the final week of his life, is attested in independent sources, one of the most important criteria for the historicity of an event. In doing this, Jesus was deliberately and provocatively claiming that he was the promised Messiah, the King of Israel. Moreover, the plaque nailed to Jesus' cross stated the charge against him, in mockery of his messianic claims. The fact that later Christians did not use this derisive title for Jesus underscores its authenticity. For first-century Jews, the word Messiah was packed full of meaning. By assuming this title, Jesus was claiming all of this for himself. Jesus also claimed to be the Son of God. Jesus' consciousness of being God's Son in a unique sense comes to expression in his parable of the vineyard. This parable matches Jesus' teaching style and employs Jewish motifs typical of his day, such as Israel as a vineyard, God as a father, the religious leaders of that time as tenants, and God's prophets as servants sent to the tenants. Once there was a man who planted a vineyard. Before leaving the country, he leased it to tenants. At harvest time, he sent a servant to collect his share of the fruit of the vineyard, but the tenants beat him and sent him away empty-handed. So, the owner sent more servants, but these too were beaten or killed. Finally, he sent his one and only son, saying, "Surely they'll respect my son. But those tenants said to one another, 'This is the heir. Let's kill him, and the vineyard will be ours.' So they killed the owner's son." What do we learn from this parable about Jesus' self-understanding? He thought of himself as the only Son of God, God's final messenger, distinct from all the prophets and even the heir of Israel itself. Third, Jesus claimed to be the Son of Man. This was Jesus' favorite self-designation, being used some 80 times in the Gospels. This has convinced the vast majority of New Testament historians that Jesus did, in fact, think of himself as the Son of Man. Notice, not just a Son of Man, but the Son of Man. Jesus was directing our attention to a vision described by the prophet Daniel. "I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven, there came one like a son of man. And he came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him." At Jesus' trial, the Jewish high priest accused Jesus. "Are you the Messiah, the Son of God?" His answer left no room for doubt. "I am. And you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven." By applying all three of these titles to himself, Jesus was claiming in no uncertain terms that he was the very God his accusers worshipped. It's no surprise the Jewish court charged him with blasphemy and condemned him to death. But that's not all. New Testament historians are agreed that the historical Jesus also claimed to have divine power and authority to perform miracles, cast out demons, revise Old Testament law, and forgive sins. He even went so far as to claim that everyone's eternal destiny is determined solely by whether we believe in him. Jesus' self-understanding cannot be reduced to that of a Jewish teacher or a charismatic leader. No. In fact, by putting himself in God's place, Jesus was making a far greater claim about himself than anyone else ever has, before or since.
Okay, so the accusation that Jesus never claimed to be God, I think, is best answered on why did they kill him. Right? I mean, the reason they killed him is because he made statements that implied that he was God. Right? So he was accused of blasphemy and killed. And these are in your handouts, so we don't have to read them right now. But the "I am" and you'll see the Son of Man statement, right, is in Mark. And then the "before Abraham was born, I am," that's in John. So statements that have him saying basically that he's God, and the reason that they killed him. So, questions, comments? Yep.
I think too, like, maybe this is on here, but one of the points where they are accusing him of blasphemy, that he asks them, like, "Why are you accusing me?" And they specifically say, "Because you, being a man, make yourself God."
Yeah.
And it's like there was no confusion to them as to what Jesus was saying. There's a lot of confusion now.
Right.
They were not.
And a lot of people say, where in here does Jesus say, "I am God"?
Right.
Well, he doesn't, but everything else that he does says that he thought he was.
That would be a great place for
Yeah.
Jesus to have
Yeah.
stepped up and said, "Oh, now wait a second, now
Yeah.
you're
You
mistaken."
got me all wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
he didn't do. He doubled down.
Right.
I wanted to comment that I'd heard with the argument of the Son of God and the Son of Man.
Mm-hmm.
I've heard people say that Jesus saying that he was the Son of God meant that he was not God, but that he was just somehow had been created by God and was God's Son. And so the simple response to that is, well, he claimed to be the Son of Man. Does that mean that he wasn't a man?
Right.
Right. Yeah.
But I think these two
But yeah,
statements
I am,
kind
yeah.
of make it clear.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Most unbelievers don't really know about the I am statements.
Right,
Mhm.
right.
Right.
You have to teach them.
Yeah.
The reading, I don't know if this is a good time to ask this question, but the reading talked about 71 Sanhedrin. And I don't really know that much about the Sanhedrin. What do you know? What can you tell us?
Like, I don't know about, they
Yeah.
were like
I just-
the law, like the Supreme Court, I think, is what they're been compared to, but, yeah.
Yeah, I just wondered, I thought, what do we have, 9 on our Supreme Court, and they have
Yeah.
71 on theirs.
Yeah.
So I wondered,
Yeah.
I just wondered.
How they ever got anything done.
They just packed theirs, probably.
Yeah.
Got there.
Packed it, that's what happens. But, yeah, anyway, I just was curious.
Yeah, no, I don't know anything offhand.
Yeah, they talked about Joseph,
Right,
and he was a dissenter.
Right.
It seemed really logical to me.
Right.
You're not gonna get unanimity from 71 people.
Yeah.
right. Okay, so in addition, he did a lot of other things that implied that he was God, right? Who can forgive sins? Right? Who can change Old Testament law? Right? Who can accept prayer? And he didn't correct them, right, when he accepted prayer. And he accepted worship. And he commended those who acknowledged him as a deity. So I think adding to those, the accusation of blasphemy, this makes it pretty strong.
Yeah, if you're talking about like one passage and you just kind of, well, no, yes, he did say that, and
Yeah.
he did blah blah blah.
Yeah.
You can get bogged down, but if
Right.
you just give that list, it's like okay,
Yeah.
read all of these,
Yeah.
then tell me he's not God.
Or tell me that at least he didn't think he was God.
Yeah.
Especially in the context of the Old Testament. I mean, I think a lot of people are like, well, yeah, all kinds of people accept worship. It's like,
Yeah.
not the Jews, though.
Yeah, yeah.
Like, there wouldn't be, I mean, that's why it was blasphemy.
Right.
Nobody,
Yeah.
everybody knew what that was only reserved for God.
In fact, the apostles, when they're teaching, people start to worship them and they
Right.
instantly
They're
say,
like,
stop
"No."
that.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so any other questions on Jesus claiming to be God? Okay, so the next one then is the historical evidence for the resurrection. And this is Gary Habermas talking about it, so watch this. Make sure the volume's okay.
So what is like your 5-minute spiel on the evidence in support of the resurrection? These are facts, these are historical facts, and this is what you specialize in. So
Yeah. I start with what I call a minimal facts argument. It's a species of reliability. What are the reliability arguments? Where most reliability arguments are top-down arguments, if the book is reliable, it's like an umbrella. Everything under it gets kept, from the rain. If the book is generally true, whatever's reported under it is accurate. Mine's a bottom-up, and instead of an umbrella, I would suggest an example of a brick wall with individual facts being bricks that we put together to build a case from the bottom up. And I've used anywhere from 3 to 7 over the years. Lately I've been doing 6. And I would say, Jesus died by crucifixion. His disciples had experiences that they believed were appearances of the risen Jesus. Because of their belief that he was raised, it is the event that has turned the world upside down religiously. In fact, a recent book on non-believing Jews and the resurrection, they even acknowledge, not being Christians, that Christianity is a resurrection religion. It was the resurrection that powered the religion, powered the teachings, even to the point of being willing to die. And we do have first century sources for arguably the 3 largest names in Christianity. 4, very important, it was proclaimed very early. And today, critics, the consensus position is that you can track the resurrection preaching back to immediately after the cross. In fact, the way it's often stated by, say, Bart Ehrman, is that when Paul said yes to Jesus on the way to Damascus, there was already a body of data called the early creeds that are later written in the New Testament, but they were already being noised abroad. When Paul said yes, there were these heavy creeds, about 80% of which are in the deity, death, resurrection of Jesus, and that's a major message. They were already in existence. So when Paul didn't invent Christianity. The main reason, when he came to Christ, the message he hated most We already have data from that 2-year period before Paul. And then the last two would be individuals, James, the brother of Jesus, and Paul, both of whom become Christians because they believed they had experiences which were appearances of the risen Jesus. Those are the 6 I would use. And to my knowledge, I've had dialogues with atheists, agnostics, scholars, specialists, and they don't dispute any of those.
So how do they respond to this? That you have these facts?
So he uses what he calls the minimal facts evidence for the resurrection, and he changes it all the time. In the lecture that he gave to us, these are the minimal facts he gave to us, but he kind of messes around with them. And what he calls minimal facts are historical facts that 75 to 80% of New Testament scholars would agree to. So he leaves anything out that it doesn't get to 75 or 80%, and then he focuses on those. So 75 to 80% of New Testament scholars, including atheist New Testament scholars, which always seems weird to me that you'd be an atheist and a New Testament scholar. But anyway, they all agree Jesus died by crucifixion. That's indisputable. They all agree that the disciples believe that he rose from the dead. The disciples believe that he rose from the dead and appeared to them. Okay? Indisputable that the disciples believe that. They all agree that Paul changed suddenly, right, from a Jew persecuting Christians to becoming a Christian. They all agree that James, the brother of Jesus, changed suddenly. And they all agree that the tomb was empty. And I guess he's added in there that the apostles were willing to die, which I didn't have in there. But so if you just look at that, if 75 to 80% of New Testament scholars all agree on those minimal facts, any explanation other than it really happened is going to be really difficult. People manage to come up with some explanations, but they're all really ad hoc and very strange. So thoughts on the minimal fact argument? Thoughts or comments?
It seems a lot of people throw out things without really even researching it. Like,
Right.
well, the tomb wasn't,
Yeah.
they went to the wrong tomb, or this or that, and they
Yeah.
just throw out these things without really investigating.
Right. In terms of the apostles dying, Sean McDowell is Josh McDowell's son. Sean McDowell did his doctoral dissertation on the deaths of the apostles. And Habermas said 3, but Sean will say there's 4 indisputable martyrdoms of the apostles, 4 for sure. The other ones, you can't really prove it, but he said 4 for sure were martyred for what they believed. The other ones maybe, but you can focus on 4, and that still kind of helps the argument that they all were willing to die for their faith.
So which 4?
I've forgotten. Paul, I think Paul, Peter, and I can't remember the other ones. Yeah. But even the atheist New Testament scholar would agree that there were at least 4. Okay, other questions or comments on that? The minimal historical facts for the resurrection?
This isn't related to the resurrection, but I was recently watching a video by Wes Huff, who's a really great New Testament scholar, and he was talking about how it was only like an 8 to 10 minute video, but he was just giving one example in every chapter of Mark, where Jesus does something that only God can do.
Right.
And so I think a lot of times atheists say, well, John is late, and it's not late, but they'll say John is late. They did all these additions because by the time John was written, they had decided, we want Jesus to be God, right? And so then they made these more clear statements.
Right.
And they're like, if you go back to Mark, Matthew, it's nowhere in there. But that video was just fantastic because he was showing that while John is more declarative and direct with the statements, Mark is almost like a collage of Jesus doing all these incredible things that only God could do, and showing you that Jesus could only be God rather than directly telling you as John did. So that was just fantastic, and Wes Huff is amazing. So.
And it's why a lot of people use Paul's writings, because the scholars will accept Paul's writings as authentic and as early. And you can find all the early creeds in Paul's writings, which is why Habermas books are well known.
Yeah.
Okay. So the last point, then again, remember what we're doing is trying to show that there's no way that that Jesus was a legend, and in this case, we're showing that he's not a liar. Right. So we're kind of answering that legend liar accusation. Okay. So the last thing is, did the New Testament writers lie? Did they make it up? Right. And the embarrassing testimony that they include in there is one of the best things to point out. They probably weren't making this up, because they were including embarrassing things about themselves and about Jesus too. So this is Frank Turek again. So hopefully the volume's good.
Have you ever lied to make yourself look good? Yeah, of course you have. Now, have you ever lied to make yourself look bad? No, you would never do that. And the principle of embarrassment goes like this. If there's something embarrassing in the text, it's probably true, because the authors would never make themselves look bad, just like you would never lie to make yourself look bad. Well, the New Testament documents are filled with embarrassing details that they never would have invented. For example, the New Testament writers depict themselves as dim-witted. They don't understand what Jesus is saying. They don't understand his mission. In fact, they don't really get his mission until he's already ascended to heaven. And then they go, wow, I could have had a V8. Up to that point, they didn't know. Peter, their leader, is called Satan by Jesus. That's embarrassing. And of course, Peter says, look, Lord, I'll never deny you. What does he wind up doing? He winds up denying the Lord 3 times. This is their leader. And then if you look in Galatians chapter 2, you see Paul rebuking Peter for being wrong about a theological issue. Why are 2 apostles arguing over theology in the Bible if they're making this up? They're not. It's embarrassing, but they're telling the truth. And then at the crucifixion, the disciples run away. Why would they run away? Why would they admit they ran away? They wouldn't. It must have really happened. And then the first witnesses at the tomb are women. Why would they invent that? In fact, in that culture, a woman's testimony was not considered on par with that of a man. So if you were making up the New Testament resurrection story, you'd only have the men be the first witnesses. Yet all 4 Gospels say the women were the first witnesses, which is telling us what? They really were. They never would have invented it. Never would have invented that. In fact, I had a woman come up to me once and she said, I know why Jesus appeared to the women first. I said, why? And she said, because he wanted to get the story out. And then if you look in Matthew chapter 28, verse 17, this is 2 verses before the so-called Great Commission, when Jesus is standing there and he says, go therefore, make disciples of all nations. That passage, as they're standing there, it says the disciples, some believed, but some doubted. How did that verse get in the Bible? He's already resurrected, and they're doubting it's him. You think they invented that? No. It's embarrassing. They're just telling the truth. There's even embarrassing details about Jesus. In Mark chapter 3, his own family thinks he's out of his mind. They want to come and seize him to take away. Jesus' family does. Now, you may have heard people say, the scholars say that the New Testament writers invented Jesus to be God. Really? Then why are they saying his own family thinks he's nuts? And he's also called a drunkard. He's called demon-possessed. He has his feet wiped with the hair of a prostitute, which easily could have been seen as a sexual advance. And oh, by the way, you know there are 2 prostitutes in Jesus' bloodline? Rahab and Tamar. Do you think Matthew and Luke got together and said, you know what, I really think we need to spice up the Messiah's bloodline. Put a couple of prostitutes in there. No, I don't think so. They're just telling the truth, as embarrassing as it is. You will never see this in a Pharaoh's bloodline. You will never see the Pharaoh being called a drunkard, being called demon-possessed, or having prostitutes in his bloodline. Any Pharaoh would chop the heads off of his historians if they ever said that, but the New Testament is telling us the truth, as embarrassing as it is. You want the ultimate no-spin zone? Read the Bible.
Okay, thoughts on that?
Another thing is how often Gospels, he's referring to people, non-Jewish people, right? The Samaritans,
Right.
or military people, or Roman people, that sort of thing. So
Right.
those sorts of things being included in there would also be an embarrassment to the Jewish readers.
Right, yeah, right. Good point. Yeah. I mean, the Good Samaritan story, I think, was meant to be an embarrassment.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
Right? So,
I like how the inclusion of the women being the first witnesses,
Right.
you know, being an embarrassment to them. That's something that just completely escapes us in our culture.
Right,
But
right.
to theirs is very significant. So it's something that's easily overlooked by us.
Well, Jesus' attitude toward women was just different than everybody else.
Right, right.
I mean, there was a group of women that traveled with him, and it was the women that supplied the financial support
Right,
for
right.
the whole group a lot of times, which
Yeah.
was definitely not the usual.
Yeah.
Okay, so I listed some other ones. This comes from Frank Turk's book, actually. Which you saw the title up there next. I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. It's a really good book if you've read it. But the disciples, he mentioned that, right? The disciples fail to understand what Jesus is saying. They fall asleep on him twice.
Yes.
Right? Twice. Jesus and Paul both rebuke Peter for being wrong. All the disciples except one hide when Jesus goes to the cross. Right? Despite being taught that Jesus will rise from the dead, the disciples doubt that he did. And he's considered out of his mind. And yeah, so I think a lot of those he mentioned. But so any other questions or comments on that?
I would say if you want to know more about these principles of embarrassment, there's a YouTuber called Testify who has he's got like 15 or 20 videos. They're just nice bite-sized, like 5-minute videos, and they go over not only, more general ones like this, but very specific, like verse-by-verse historical ones.
Right.
And it's just nice and easy. You can put it on and listen to one in the morning or something. And they're just amazing. I mean, it's really incredible. So.
Who's the author of those?
The name of his channel is Testify. He's got a playlist with probably 15 or 20 videos specifically on like principles of embarrassment and things like that.
Well, through the Bible, it tells stuff that was absolutely horrible about in Jewish history and everything else. I mean, look at the last chapter of Judges. Good grief.
Yeah, they don't try to hide anything, do they?
No.
Well, I mean, the first time I was challenged to read through the Bible, I was 10 years old.
Yeah.
When I got to that one, oh my goodness. That was a lot to take at 10 years old.
Isn't it that every major leader in the Bible did something really bad, except for Joshua?
Joshua.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Dan?
And Daniel, yeah, except for Joshua and Daniel.
And he was too busy fighting to do it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, well, to finish up, I have a couple review videos. We can watch those, or we can discuss the conclusion. What do you want to do? Watch the videos? Okay, so
Sounds good.
okay. So, review of this section, actually.
Why was Jesus of Nazareth crucified? Because he made outrageous claims about himself. He claimed to be the one and only Son of God. Why would anyone take his claim seriously? Well, that all depends. If Jesus actually rose from the dead, then his claim to be God's unique Son carries considerable weight. On the other hand, if the resurrection never actually happened, then Jesus may be safely dismissed as just another interesting but tragic historical figure. Did Jesus rise from the dead? As we explore this question, we need to address two further questions. What are the facts that require explanation? And which explanation best accounts for these facts? There are three main facts that need to be explained. The discovery of Jesus' empty tomb, the appearances of Jesus alive after his death, and the disciples' belief that Jesus rose from the dead. Let's examine each of these. Fact number one. The discovery that Jesus' tomb was empty is reported in no less than 6 independent sources, and some of these are among the earliest materials to be found in the New Testament. This is important because when an event is recorded by 2 or more unconnected sources, historians' confidence that the event actually happened increases. And the earlier these sources are dated, the higher their confidence. Moreover, the Gospels indicate that it was women who first discovered that Jesus' body was missing. This is likely historical because in that culture, a woman's testimony was considered next to worthless. A later legend or fabrication would have had men make this discovery. Our confidence in the empty tomb is further increased by the response of the Jewish authorities. When they heard the report that the tomb was found empty, they said that Jesus' followers had stolen his body, thereby admitting that Jesus' tomb was, in fact, empty. Most scholars, by far, hold firmly to the reliability of the biblical statements about the empty tomb. Fact number 2. The appearances of Jesus alive after his death. In one of the earliest letters in the New Testament, Paul provides a list of witnesses to Jesus' resurrection appearances. He appeared to Peter, then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. Finally, he appeared also to me. Furthermore, various resurrection appearances of Jesus are independently confirmed by the Gospel accounts. On the basis of Paul's testimony alone, virtually all historical scholars agree that various individuals and groups experienced appearances of Jesus alive after his death. It may be taken as historically certain that Peter and the disciples had experiences after Jesus' death in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ. Fact number 3. The disciples' belief in the resurrection. After Jesus' crucifixion, his followers were devastated, demoralized, and hiding in fear for their lives. As Jews, they had no concept of a Messiah who would be executed by his enemies, much less come back to life. The only resurrection Jews believed in was a universal event on Judgment Day after the end of the world, not an individual event within history. Moreover, in Jewish law, Jesus' crucifixion as a criminal meant that he was literally under God's curse. Yet somehow, despite all of this, the disciples suddenly and sincerely came to believe that God had raised Jesus from the dead. They were so completely convinced that, when threatened with death, not one of them recanted. Even the Pharisee Paul, who persecuted Christians, suddenly became a Christian himself, as did Jesus' skeptical younger brother, James. Some sort of powerful, transformative experience is required to generate the sort of movement earliest Christianity was. That is why, as an historian, I cannot explain the rise of early Christianity unless Jesus rose again, leaving an empty tomb behind him. These 3 firmly established facts cry out for an adequate explanation. How do you make sense of them? Down through history, various naturalistic explanations have been offered to explain away these facts. The conspiracy hypothesis, the apparent death hypothesis, the hallucination hypothesis, and so on. All of these have been nearly universally rejected by contemporary scholarship. The simple fact is that there is just no plausible naturalistic explanation of these 3 facts. The explanation given by the original eyewitnesses is that God raised Jesus from the dead. If it's even possible that God exists, then that explanation cannot be ruled out. For a God who is able to create the entire universe, the odd resurrection would be child's play. An empty tomb, Jesus' appearances alive after his death, and a group of dejected followers suddenly transformed by a radical new belief in a risen Messiah. These are independently established historical facts. How do you explain them?
So this next one is going to run us over like a minute. Have permission? Okay. So this actually looks at different explanations. Goes with it.
It's a matter of historical record that Jesus of Nazareth died and his body was placed in a tomb. It's also been firmly established that after his death and burial, his tomb was found empty. Various individuals and groups saw appearances of Jesus alive, and his disciples somehow became absolutely convinced that Jesus had risen from the dead. These are the historical facts. How do you explain them? Down through history, various naturalistic explanations have been offered to explain away these facts. Let's examine the 4 most popular ones. First, the conspiracy theory. According to this view, the disciples faked the resurrection. They stole Jesus' body from the tomb and then lied about seeing Jesus alive, thereby perpetrating the greatest hoax of all time. However, this theory faces overwhelming objections. It's hopelessly anachronistic. It looks at the disciples' situation through the rear-view mirror of Christian history, instead of from the standpoint of a first-century Jew. Jews had no concept of a Messiah who would be defeated and executed by Israel's enemies, much less rise from the dead. In Jewish thinking, the resurrection of the dead was a general event that takes place only after the end of the world and has no connection at all with the Messiah. The conspiracy theory also fails to address the disciples' obvious sincerity. People don't willingly die for something they know is not true. An honest reading of the New Testament makes it clear. These people sincerely believed the message they proclaimed and were willing to die for. For these and other reasons, no scholar defends the conspiracy theory today. A second attempt to explain the facts is the apparent death theory. Jesus didn't really die. He revived in the tomb, somehow escaped, and managed to convince his disciples he was risen from the dead. This theory also faces insurmountable obstacles. First, it's medically impossible. The Roman executioners were professionals. They knew what they were doing and made sure their victims were dead before taken down. Moreover, Jesus was tortured so extensively that even if he was taken down alive, he would have died in the sealed tomb. Second, this theory is wildly implausible. Seeing a half-dead man who crawled out of the tomb, desperately in need of bandaging and medical attention, would hardly have convinced the disciples that he was gloriously risen from the dead. As a result, no New Testament historians defend this theory today. A third explanation is the displaced body theory. Perhaps Joseph of Arimathea placed Jesus' body in his tomb temporarily because it was convenient. But later, he moved the corpse to a criminal's common graveyard. So, when the disciples visited the first tomb and found it empty, they concluded that Jesus must have risen from the dead. Once again, this theory cannot make sense of the facts. Jewish laws prohibited moving a corpse after it was interred, except to the family tomb. What's more, the criminal's graveyard was located close to the place of execution, so that burial there would not have been a problem. Also, once the disciples began to proclaim Jesus' resurrection, Joseph would have corrected their mistake. So, once again, no current scholars endorse this theory. Finally, the hallucination theory. The disciples didn't really see Jesus, but just imagined that he appeared before them. They were all hallucinating. This theory also faces considerable problems. First, Jesus appeared not just one time, but many times. Not just in one place, but in different places. Not just to one person, but to different persons. Not just to individuals, but to groups of people. And not just to believers, but to unbelievers as well. There is nothing in the psychological casebooks on hallucinations comparable to these resurrection appearances. Second, hallucinations of Jesus would have led the disciples to believe at most that Jesus had been transported to heaven, not risen from the dead, in contradiction to their Jewish beliefs. Moreover, in the ancient world, visions of the deceased were not evidence that the person was alive, but evidence that he was dead and had moved on to the afterworld. Finally, this theory doesn't even attempt to explain the empty tomb. Thus, the four most popular naturalistic theories fail to explain the historical facts. Where does that leave us? Another possibility is the explanation given by the original eyewitnesses that God raised Jesus from the dead.
So I'll stop it there because we're over. You can predict what he's going to say. So, any last comments?
The displaced theory was kind of interesting that the body was moved to a different tomb.
Right.
But then Justice Arimathea, being a Jew, would have been doing work on the Sabbath. So
Right.
that-
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which is they didn't mention that. Yeah. Okay. So next week we'll kind of just do a quick summary of the book, and then again there are plans to continue something at this time for adults. But they want input. So for next week, just some things to think about. Do you like going through a book? Do you like it to be apologetics focused or something else? Do you want it to actually be a class or more of just reading in a discussion? Things to think about. Should we take turns leading, or is there something else? So think about that for next week. So because they want some input, but there's going to be a class at this time continuing, but they want input on what it should be like. So anything else? Okay, you may want to close us in prayer. Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Lord, thank you so much for your word. Thank you so much for being a good father to us. And Lord, help us to always trust you. And Lord, forgive us when we fail. And bless us today as we worship you. And help us to worship you in the spirit and in truth. In the name of Christ, amen.